Be not elated at any excellence which is not your own. If the horse in his elation were to say, I am beautiful, it could be endured. But when you say in your elation, I have a beautiful horse, rest assured that you are elated at something good which belongs to a horse. What then is your own? The use of external impressions. Therefore, when you are in harmony with nature in the use of external impressions, then be elated, for then it will be some good of your own, at which you will be elated. Chapter 6 stresses a disjunction that Epictetus has already introduced in the Enchiridion between that which belongs to us or is in our control and what is external, what is, in many respects, quite literally, none of our business, certainly not our affair. And so this example about a horse, and we can think of all sorts of other things that we might connect this with in our own time, since horses are not such a feature of our everyday experience, I think, for most of us, really drives this home. He says, be not elated at any excellence that is not your own. Literally, that belongs to something else. So if the horse, he says, if we hypothesize, right, the horse could be proud of its own beauty or of its own strength or its own, winning the first prize at the fair, anything along those lines. If the horse in his elation were to say, I am beautiful, I am fine, I am kalon, right? Then it could be endured. We could put up with that. It would make sense. But, he says, when you say in your elation, I have a beautiful horse, rest assured that you're elated at something good which belongs to something else, in this case, a horse. And how many things can we say this about? You could run through the entire listing of things that are not really in our control that people tend to be excited about, to be proud about, to want to brag about, to want everybody to notice them for. We could start with the body. Some people are born tall. I was fortunate in that respect. I didn't do anything to get born tall. It's not something that I should actually be proud of as if I'd achieved something. I suppose if I did exercises which made me tall, that could be the case. Other people are really into their clothing. People can spend an awful lot of time researching what the fashions are, and they actually can identify this is something where I'm totally deficient. They can identify if this person is wearing that shirt or that handbag or this accessory, and they care about that sort of thing. But that's totally, when we say that's not you, we don't just mean that that's not your style. It's not you. You can strip away all of that, as happens to people in disasters, or say when they go to prison, or when they switch into their pajamas for going to sleep at night, or their swimwear. Think about the possessions that we own that people are so proud of. Oh, I've got a great car. I've got a great computer. I've got a beautiful house. That's great, but it's the house that's beautiful. It's not you that is in any way beautiful for owning a beautiful house. You're not a better person in any respect because you have nice things. This is a common tendency, though. You see this in all societies pretty much, that there are some possessions that are, marking their possessors apart from other people as somehow being better than them. We can say the same thing about power and fame and political office. I often observe when people, because I get recognized now because of the videos, I'll say, well, there's famous, and then there's YouTube famous, so you don't want to get too worked up about that sort of thing. Now imagine what it's like for people whose faces are on billboards and who then, walk around. Oh, that billboard, even that might be an image of your face, but it's not you. The mere fact that some advertising agency thought that your face ought to be up there, really not that big of a deal when you think about it. being mentioned in books, having a Wikipedia article devoted to you, which actually could be a bad thing given the way that Wikipedia sometimes works and the way the editing process gets carried out. We could go on and on and on. Holding a political office is not necessarily a sign that you're equipped for the office or that you're the best person for the job as compared to your competitors, or even that you have a good, head or heart. So to be elated, to be worked up, to be excited, to be proud of things that don't really belong to you, that's a problem. Why? He says, well, what is your own? And notice that he only talks about one of the things that is our own, one of the things that does in fact belong to us, but it's a really central one. And this is what he calls the use of external impressions, or the chresis, that's the word for using. Also means the way in which we use things. And then external impressions or appearances are fantasia. So what really is our own? The ways in which we respond to what is coming in from the outside. How do we use them? Do we use them well? Do we use them poorly? Do we respond to them in a thoughtful way that could be, at least to some degree rational? Or do we immediately jump to all sorts of conclusions and then, get angry, get upset, get anxious? All of these are possibilities for use. And Epictetus will stress that although external things themselves are indifferent, our use of them is not. Our use of them is very important. Our relationships with other people, that is a matter of fantasia, which then we can use as well. Fantasia can also be not necessarily external, but inside of ourselves. How do we think about our own selves? That is indeed up to us. How do we make use of the ideas that we've taken in and internalized and made our own? How do we make use of Stoic philosophy? All of that is a matter of what is really in our power. And if we want to feel proud about anything, that's what we should feel proud about. So he says, therefore, when you are in harmony with nature in the use of external impressions, then be elated. Don't be elated. Don't think a lot of yourself because you have a great house. Think a lot of yourself if you actually can use that great house in a proper way so that you're not just wasting that wonderful resource that's been given to you. Likewise, if somebody or a lot of people think well enough of you to entrust you with political office or, to be in a position of responsibility in some institution, then make use of that and make the proper use, and then you've got something to be proud of. If you've got a great body, that's great, but what about your mind? What about your soul? That's what you want to attend to. So this is some classic, Stoic advice. He's saying, then it will be some good of your own, what really belongs to you, at which you will be elated. If you're going to be proud, if you're going to be elated, if you're going to be worked up about something, let it be the things that really do, in fact, fall within your purview. Just as on a voyage when your ship has anchored, if you should go on shore to get fresh water, you may pick up a small shellfish or a little bulb on the way. But you have to keep your attention fixed on the ship, and turn about frequently for fear lest the captain should call. And if he calls, you must give up all these things if you would escape being thrown on board all tied up like the sheep. So it is also in life. If there be given you, instead of a little bulb and a small shellfish, a little wife and child, there will be no objection to that. Only, if the captain calls, give up all these things and run to the ship, without even turning around to look back. And if you are an old man, never even get very far away from the ship, for fear that when he calls, you may be missing. What we have here in chapter 7 is a very interesting little metaphor, or if you like, a story, an allegory about how we ought to approach life. And it's telling us a little bit about the shortness of life and about how contingent everything is and how we ought to comport ourselves. So he says, just as on a voyage when your ship has been anchored, right? So for us, that's probably not something quite so easy to relate to. We might think about when you're at the airport and you're waiting for your connecting flight, or when you're on a road trip and you've parked and you're waiting, or taking a bus or a train or anything like that. He says, if you should go on shore to get fresh water, you may pick up some items, right? You can wander around a bit. You can find some things that catch your fancy. That's okay. Nothing wrong with that. He says, a small shellfish or a little bulb, right? You pick some raw onions on the way. But you have to keep your attention fixed on the ship and turn about frequently for fear lest the captain should call. So you don't want to wander off too far. And, you might actually say at this point, well, wait a second. If this is a metaphor about life and how we ought to be living it, wouldn't it be nicer if once they let us go ashore, we never come back? Why should we listen to the captain? Well, because as we're going to see a little bit later on, when you get called back, you don't really have a choice about it. Death, when it comes, is going to find you either prepared for it or not prepared for it. So he goes on and he says, when the captain calls, you must give up all these things if you would escape being thrown on board and all tied up like the sheep. The sheep or other livestock don't really want to travel, and so what they do is they tie them up and then they just throw them on board. So you can approach your life and its end and the things that fill your life, all these considerations. You can do that in a thoughtful way, in a way that's going to allow you to be prepared for when you do meet your end, or you're going to be dragged, essentially, as we say, kicking and screaming, and get thrown on the same deck anyway. If you're going to die at a particular time from a particular reason, and there's a whole discussion that could be had about Stoics and fate, but we don't need to go into that here. But if you're going to die, what will matter at that point is whether you're ready for it or not, whether you have a good death or not. So we do pick up a lot of things along the way. All you need to do in order to see that is go into somebody's automobile and see all the stuff that's accumulated in it. Or look at a house. If somebody owns a house, go down in their basement or wherever else they're storing all the stuff that they haven't figured out what to do with it. Look at their junk drawer, right? And you're usually going to find there's a lot of things that have not been taken care of and are not in order. And, many people die. It's not so much about possessions, although perhaps they die without a will and their heirs have to fight over things. But a lot of people die and they haven't really attended to their relationships. They haven't adequately looked at what's going on in all their different connections with other people, with their family, with their friends, with their neighbors, with other people that they're involved with. They avoid thinking about these sorts of things because they would rather focus on the living than on what's going to happen eventually. But, this is worth considering. Do you want to reach the end having all sorts of unfinished business that you're now not going to have the time for? You're going to have to drop the little bulb. You're going to have to drop the little shellfish that you've picked up. You're going to have to drop all the other stuff. And when you drop it, are you going to break it? Is it going to be lost? Is it going to be in bad condition? That's well worth considering. So he goes on and he says, so it is also in life. If there be given you, instead of a little bulb and a small shellfish, a little wife and child, there will be no objection to that. That everybody's fine with being given things. Only if the captain calls. Give up all these things and run to the ship without even turning around to look back. If they're in good condition, they'll do fine. You're going to have to leave them behind no matter what. So, you have to cultivate a certain level, you might say, or attitude at least of, or at least inclination or wish for detachment. Because sooner or later, everything that you have will, in fact, not be taken away from you, but as he says later on, be given back. So he says, if you're an old man, never even get very far away from the ship, for fear that when he calls, you may be missing. So, particularly when we're old, and Epictetus, at the time that he's teaching, describes himself as an older man. When we're old, we have to think about this even more, because our time, ironically, the longer we live, the shorter our time gets, right? We have a much longer stretch behind us. The young have much more time ahead of them, even though they have very little time behind them. So this is a good metaphor. It can help us to, if we think about it and reflect upon it, it can help us to structure our life in ways that are going to be helpful for us and allow us to approach things that we normally think of as calamities, like death, with a certain measure of tranquility. Do not seek to have everything that happens happen as you wish, but wish for everything to happen as it actually does happen, and your life will be serene. Chapter 8 is one of the shortest chapters in Epictetus' Enchiridion. It is, in fact, one of those dogmata or, sayings or ways of thinking about things that you want to have ready at hand when you encounter difficulties. I mean, you could look it up in the book, but it's so short that you could easily memorize it and then have it available as a resource. So don't seek to have everything that happens happen as you wish. And the Greek for that is thela, what you want things to be, what your will is. So, if you're drinking coffee, perhaps the coffee got cold while you're, waiting to have a chance to drink it. Well, you'd like for it to be warm, but in order to do that, you've got to go warm it up, right? It's not going to magically do that by itself. But coffee being cold is not really that big of a deal in the grand scheme of things, is it? So don't seek to have everything that happens happen as you wish, but here's where a reversal takes place, and this is something that we can, in fact, do. Wish for everything to happen as it actually does happen, and your life will be serene. You will actually be content. You will be happy. So you might say this is telling you, hey, you should just, whatever happens, just suck it up and get used to it. That's not actually willing that things be the way they are. That's not an attitude of, you might say, detachment and letting things be. That's actually being resentful that things aren't the way that you want them to be, but realizing that you can't force them into the mold of your own wish, will, desire, however you want to put it. So it's not a reactive attitude. It's rather a acceptance of things as they are, and going beyond mere acceptance and willing that things be the way they are. It's an affirmation. So we can do this in a lot of respects. One way that he doesn't talk about here, but I think can be quite helpful, is, you've got the coffee, and you say, oh, the coffee's gotten cold. Oh. Well, cold coffee is, pretty good. Sometimes we like iced coffee. It's not quite iced coffee at this point, but it's on its way. And, I may not be tasting exactly the flavors that I like so much in hot coffee, but, there's also flavors that when the coffee cools, you taste in a different way, and I kind of like those as well. Now, not everything can be so easily worked on upon that way so that we find the good side in everything, but we can realize that things work the way that they do because that's the way the world is arranged. That's the way that the world is set up. So, for example, when we apply for a job, and, we get pretty far along. Nowadays you fill things out online, and then they call you back, and then maybe they Skype with you, and then maybe they say, why don't you come in, and then let's have an interview. And you get there and you find out, well, there's, 5 other candidates being considered, and we'll get back to you. And then, a week later, you get that call saying, well, we've offered the job to somebody else. That's very upsetting. And it's very easy, and I'm speaking from experience here, when you do apply for a job to already engage in all sorts of imaginings. That's what Epictetus calls fantasia, appearances, right? The appearance is, I'm going to get this job. And then all the intellectual, motor works start running, and your emotions start getting involved. You start thinking, oh, I wonder if my office is going to be nice. And I'm going to have some great responsibilities to deal with because that's what they talked about. This will be an opportunity for me to grow. And you start to get quite excited and anticipate having the job. And then you are disappointed. It doesn't go according to your wish, your will. You have a choice at that point. You can maintain your will and say, the world should revolve around my wishes, my desires, and somehow conform itself to them. And if it doesn't do so, that's because it's a bad world. Or you can realize that if there is any badness involved, it's actually in your own viewpoint on things, that you somehow think that everything else should turn around you. I mean, consider this as well. Does everybody else think the world should turn around them? Could we possibly accommodate a world in which the world as a whole and all of its processes had to orient itself around every single person? It would be a complete chaos, wouldn't it? Because sometimes even our own desires, we're not fully coherent in what it is that we want. Our own desires are kind of a chaos and contradiction, or to use Epictetus's constant term for this, a mache, a battle, a conflict within us. So if we decide instead to wish for things to be the way that they actually are, we will free ourselves up to be happy. We won't be affected by outside circumstances disappointing us, by them contravening what it is that we wish, because we will have changed what it is that we wish for. Disease is an impediment to the body, but not to the moral purpose, unless that consents. Lameness is an impediment to the leg, but not to the moral purpose. And say this to yourself at each thing that befalls you. For you will find the thing to be an impediment to something else, but not to yourself. Here in chapter 9, Epictetus is setting out the relationship between what's really at our core, the proairesis, what's being translated here as moral purpose, also translated quite frequently as faculty of choice, all of that on the one hand, and matters that we tend to have a dread of, we view negatively, like disease, or as we've talked about in other places, death, lameness he talks about as well, and anything else that we might consider to be bad for us. So poverty, people not liking us, being forced to do things that we don't enjoy, being placed in situations of temptation. And he says, all of these aren't really impediments to ourselves in what we really are. They are impediments to other things. So he has the example here of disease. Disease is indeed an impediment to the body. Nobody is suggesting that disease is not a bad thing for the body, that it doesn't keep the body from being able to do what it desires to do or ought to do, or its function would extend to it doing. So, for example, if you have heart disease, your heart is being affected, and that doesn't just affect your heart, it's going to affect the rest of your body. If you have, an allergy to eating certain kinds of food, any of you who've experienced that know what that is like. And we could go on and on and on, right? You have a fever, you can't really effectively work, and sometimes can't even think properly, right? You just have to lay in bed until the fever breaks. So disease really does impede the body. Poverty does really interfere with you going on a vacation. People not wanting to hang out with you does interfere with you having a party and inviting everybody over. But here's where the key distinction lies. Is that interfering with or impeding you? And the answer is no. Because what you really are is not just your body or your possessions or your online presence or your capacity to have a big blowout bash or anything like that. What you are is what Epictetus is calling here moral purpose, your proairesis, right? So he says that disease is not an impediment to the proairesis, and here's an important proviso, unless you yourself consent to it. As he says here, unless it consents to it, unless it chooses. What is doing the choosing? The proairesis. That's you. You are a thing which can choose. You have a reflexivity to yourself. You can make choices about your own choices. You are capable of self-determination. And that's what makes the whole Stoic philosophy itself have any point to it whatsoever. If you were just a robot, or you were just, living a purely animalistic existence where you're just responding on the basis of your biology and what cues you've learned from your environment and perhaps some level of culture or something like that, but you had no real capacity for choice and for self-determination, there wouldn't be any point whatsoever in Stoic philosophy, or really in any moral philosophy. Why is that? Well, because you have the capacity to choose for yourself, you can in fact choose the path that says, you're right, disease is an impediment to my body, but it's not an impediment to me as such. Just because I'm sick, I don't have to be a jerk to everybody. I don't have to lay around in bed and moan and groan and say, oh, woe is me, life is terrible now, right? You can say, I'm sick and I understand that I'm sick. I'd rather not be sick than be sick, but that doesn't keep me from thinking. That doesn't keep me from being able to choose. It may make it more difficult for me. I may be more irritable or depressed or something like that when I'm physically sick, but I can choose. The other possibility is you do let it get you down. You do let it affect you. And if you do that, that's because you're using that very free faculty of choice. You are freely using it and letting something else determine it. You are letting something else make the decision for you. You are making a decision to allow something else to be decisive. So it doesn't have to be an impediment to you. He goes on and he says, lameness is an impediment to the leg, but not to the moral purpose. This is something Epictetus knew firsthand because his owner, when he was a slave, damaged his leg in such a way that he was lame thereafter. He never fully recovered. I know what that's like myself because several years back, and it still hasn't been fixed, I tore some ligaments in one of my knees. And fortunately, you can't really tell when I walk, but I certainly feel it if I walk very far. And there's, unless I actually get the operation, there's not much to be done about it. But that doesn't have to keep me, or in this case, Epictetus, from choosing freely, from thinking about the way one's life is going, from looking at our desires and aversions and deciding for ourselves, do we want to keep these desires and aversions? Are they rational? Or do we need to rework them? The moral purpose, the proairesis, is something that can function and does function independently of circumstances like that. So he goes on and he says, say this to yourself at each thing that befalls you, everything that happens to you. You will find the thing to be an impediment to something else, but not to yourself. Let's use the example of online presence, right? You get onto social media and you say, wow, I've read about these people who, have all these great interactions with other people. I'm going to do that. I'm going to get on Facebook or Twitter or, whatever, Reddit. And you get on and nobody's paying attention to you. And it takes a while before things build, as they call it, organically. And you never really have the, 5,000 friend count that you see other people have. Well, that's not an impediment to anything that really matters. That certainly is an impediment to having perhaps an online event where you invite everybody to talk about Stoicism. But it's not an impediment to you practicing Stoicism, is it? It's not an impediment to you deciding, hey, am I going to read this book or am I not going to read this book? Am I going to bring these dogmata, these ideas to bear upon my life, or am I just going to putter around kind of in a dilettantish sort of way? All of that is up to you. All of that is within your realm of choice. All of that is what you are. Your online presence is not you, even though you may have picked out a clever avatar and have all sorts of selfies in it and have written, poured out your heart into posts or something like that. It's still not you. It's something that you don't have control over, and all sorts of things can impede it, but none of those things have to actually impede you in your faculty of choice.